we shouldn't take too long. We shouldn't waste time. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmed Adigul. I'm Director of Center for Disaster Management at the University of Management and Technology. I thank you all for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to introduce the speaker for today's lecture, Dr. Karina Vink. Dr. Vink is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Construction Management and Engineering at the University of Twente, Netherlands. The research interests are green infrastructure, sustainable development, disaster risk, and disaster management policies. Some may know Dr. Vink from last year when we had a similar discussion. But this time I had to request her again because of the relevance of her very interesting research to two of the courses that I'm teaching right now. One is Sustainable Development to Public Policy graduate students, and Climate Change and Disaster Management to City and Regional Planning for City and Regional Planning undergraduate program. Students of both programs have been requested to ensure their presence in this lecture. We also have some other participants from other programs in UMT, mostly from the School of Governance and Society. I request you all to be mindful of your mic and video. There will be ample opportunity to raise your hand to ask questions during the Q&A breaks interspersed between the lecture. Please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. If you are viewing this live, type your question in the comments or chat. For those who would like to revisit this lecture, or those who couldn't join us, we'll have this recorded session placed online on our social media pages. I must add that Dr. Vink is not only a wonderful researcher and an academician, but also a very dear friend that I have the pleasure of knowing since nearly a decade while we were in the International Center for Water Hazard and Risk, International Center for Hazard and Risk Management in Japan. Dr. Vink, on behalf of the Center for Disaster Management and SDGs at UMT, we are truly grateful for your time that you've taken out for us today. I'll let you talk about the topic for today's lecture, which holds a lot of relevance for all of us working towards making our cities and urban centers more resilient to extreme weather events, including climate change, while ensuring a sustainable development. So the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me here today. I'm really happy to see so many people are already joining this lecture. Let me start by sharing the screen. All right, should be working now. So today's lecture is on green infrastructure for urban resilience and sustainable development goals. And of course, I was already introduced. I'm now working as postdoc at the University in Twente in the Netherlands. I'm mostly focusing on green infrastructure, but also other urban development goals such as climate resilience and the energy transition. And as you can see in this, in my brief work history, in 2001, I did a PhD in Japan on disaster management, which is where we met each other, and which is how I'm able to have this conversation with you today. So green infrastructure for urban resilience and sustainable goals. If you look at an urban area, and there's many pressures on these areas, such as population growth and urbanization. And on the other hand, we have pluvial flooding, fluvial flooding, heat stress, and droughts, which will become more common in the future. So obviously, we would like to have sustainable urbanization, but how can we make that happen? And today's lecture is really showing you how green infrastructure can contribute a big deal to making this happen. I have 5 different sections. I hope to have enough time to cover all of it, but in the worst case, if you have a lot of questions, we can always have more information later. So the learning objectives for today are that you will be able to explain how climate change is exacerbating the frequency and intensity of natural hazards, You can give examples of green infrastructure, but also the benefits and drawbacks. Furthermore, you can explain how green infrastructure can improve urban resilience in relation to ecosystem services and the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, you'll be able to explain difficulties and solutions in valuing green infrastructure benefits and measuring its performance. Then there's also an assignment for you to do during this lecture. It's not just me doing something. You are to come up with an exam question based on this lecture. And then from all of your answers, 1 or 2 questions will be on your actual exam. The format of this question should be open-ended, so it shouldn't be yes or no. And it's a good idea if you cover only part of this lecture in your question, rather than try to ask about this entire lecture. So I hope you come up with a fun question for today. And even more questions. I have a question for you right now, and I'd like you to type this in the chat. And it's actually two questions with just brief time to respond. The first question is, what examples of green infrastructure do you already know? So now you have 20 seconds to type this in the chat. And I'm sure Dr. Gu will inform me of what people are typing.
Yeah, the clock's ticking, guys. We have vertical forests, sponge cities. Thank you, Sami. Forests, green buildings, green walls, rainwater harvesting, energy-saving construction. And we have electric cars, green spaces. So very interesting answers. So green parking.
Yes, for most of these, yes, we can easily say it's green infrastructure. For electric cars, I'm not sure we can classify that one.
Green cars.
So
That's interesting.
for the second question, I'd like you to look outside your window. I'm assuming you're in a space that has a window and you can see outside. If not, please imagine what you remember to be outside and tell me what infrastructure, green infrastructure do you actually see? If I look outside, I can see gardens and trees. I'm very curious to know what is your environment like.
Okay, so we have trees, green belts, green side lanes, a park, trees and flowers. One of the answers is a desert. That's interesting. Like a valley, plantations, green belts, parks, and trees.
It is very interesting to hear. Also, there's a bit of difference between these two questions. All right. So let's start with the first part. And thank you everyone who replied to these questions. So first part is natural hazards and climate change. I'm sure you already know this, but just to repeat, that climate change is expected to exacerbate the intensity and frequency of natural hazards. So even if we mitigate climate change, natural hazards are still going to occur. And you see here some examples like cyclones, avalanches, earthquakes, droughts, landslides. We have floods, hurricanes, tsunami, volcano, and fires. So most of these, not the earthquakes and volcanoes, but most of these, we can try to lessen the anthropogenic effects on climate change. And then other hazards, of course, you can see some examples here. So what are the expected effects of climate change? Let's look at the Netherlands. This is a contradictory scenario. We will have higher temperatures. We will then have higher extreme rainfall, but also more drought due to the higher temperatures. So at the same time, we have warm, wet, and drier conditions than we had before. And of course, we also have the sea level rise accelerating, which is very bad for us because the Netherlands is below sea level for 2/3 of the country. So even if we have solutions now, in the future, that's not going to be enough. And if we look at the expected effects on the climate change, then we say the capital, Amsterdam, is going to have the climate, which is now in the south of France. So many people are saying, oh, that's actually nice because I like to go on holiday to the south of France because I like the temperatures. But then they're not thinking about the consequences for the ecology and how the entire growing system of our plants is not up for these changes, and climate change might actually happen faster than the species can accommodate, adapt to this. And if we look at the rain, on the left hand, you see what was already an extreme rainfall period that we had in 2010. And on the right hand side, you see if we have the same rainfall event, and then it would be 2 degrees higher. And you can see there's a lot of our country, basically all of it would be affected by this extreme rainfall. And already our sewage systems have problems dealing with this. So this would just be much, much worse. And this is the 2 degrees Celsius increase scenario that we hope to get. So it's not looking that great for us right now. Also for Pakistan, I had a look at what is the expected climate change, what would be the effects. We have frequent and intense floods and droughts. There will be a recession of the glaciers. There's going to be siltation of major dams, rising temperatures, decrease in the already scanty forest covers, intrusion of saline water, the sea level rise, increased cyclones, uh, pressures due to sharing water resources, and also increased health risk and climate change induced migration. So these are a lot of problems that we're facing. And I was actually hoping there might be some good news due to the pandemic because we're all staying more at home, we're using less energy that might affect the average carbon dioxide levels, but unfortunately, recently this has been found there's no noticeable effect just yet. So if you have any questions about this first part, please type them in the chat. And in the meantime, I will start to introduce the second part, which has examples of green infrastructure. So please feel free to interrupt me if there are any questions on this part. So green infrastructure, what is this exactly? When I started to work on this topic, I found there's really a large amount of related topics. You can think of blue-green infrastructure, sustainable drainage systems, low impact development, water sensitive urban designs, but also ecosystem-based adaptation. A lot of people are throwing around similar or related terms. So it's really hard to combine and really gather and analyze what is the latest news on green infrastructure. So I'd like to help you with a definition. This is from the European Commission. Green infrastructure is a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas with other environmental features, which are designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services. So if you read a lot of the literature about this, you can come to a comparable definition. But the main important part here is that the green infrastructure are landscape elements. They need to be planned for with the same priority as other services like communications or sanitation, roads, and other infrastructure. And why? This is a very simplified picture showing what happens if you don't manage this. Then it's not going to give you the benefits that you want it to have. So really concrete examples of green infrastructure are here in the pictures on the left and in this overview. So you can think of gardens, but also forests, as you mentioned. And there's also building greens, such as green roofs and green walls. There's also parks. This can include zoos, botanical gardens, also cemeteries and sports fields. But also there can be more private, inaccessible spaces like private gardens or railroad embankments or school playgrounds. And you can extend your definition to also include agricultural lands. The blue spaces are a bit more obvious to envision, like lakes and canals. So I think this gives a good example of what green infrastructure can be. And here's another example from the Dutch Delta Plan spatial adaptation. This is what we would like our cities to be like in the future, to be more climate change adaptive. So to have more green roofs, parks with trees providing shades, but also to have a lot more places for water storage and water drainage. So if you compare this to gray infrastructure, I like to look at this example of urban flood management. If you think of the gray infrastructure components, those are storm drains and pumps and outfalls. And what then the green infrastructure is, it can be retention areas that store stormwater and thereby reduce the drain and pump requirements. So you see here that it's not a matter of replacing existing gray infrastructure, but rather it is complementary and it helps both systems to perform well. Also for nature-based solutions, what is exactly the difference? You can see here in this picture that green infrastructure is a part of nature-based solutions, but there's actually more types of nature-based solutions possible than just green infrastructure. So how can green infrastructure help with reducing climate-related hazards? Here you see in the center of the picture, the combination of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure leading to risks. And on the right-hand side, you see the adaptation and mitigation actions, which is where green infrastructure is placed. So they can either directly reduce vulnerability and exposure, but they can also, through, for instance, reduced energy consumption, indirectly lead to reduced emissions, and then through anthropogenic climate change will reduce the hazard side. This is more of the long-term effects. And then finally, the question is, who is benefiting from this green infrastructure? If you look in this figure, we see on the left-hand side a more urban environment, and there the benefits are more strongly related to humans. So it's more of supporting green economy, sustainable lifestyles, improving human health and well-being. And as we go to the right-hand side, you can see it's more about protecting rare or endangered species. So I hope this gives you a good idea what exactly green infrastructure is. If you have any questions about this part, please type them in the chat. And I'm again going to ask you to type in the chat, because now we've seen what is green infrastructure. I like you to look outside your window again. And do you see any types of green infrastructure there now that you didn't see before? What I had when I first did this exercise myself, I saw the gardens, I saw the trees, but as I looked more closely outside, I saw, oh, there's actually also grass next to the road outside. That's also green infrastructure. Is there anything that you didn't see before?
Uh, we have a bunch of questions and comments in the chat. So I'll just select a few which seem quite interesting. According to you, how can we save our climate environment by public awareness or strict action against pollution created? I believe this question may be more relevant later when we're talking about practical implementations.
I
Or
think that's a
would you
good,
want to?
I like to take that out, the practical implementation part, yes.
Okay, sure. So Then Amira Adil says green spaces, which could act as an urban flood retention area. That's definitely one of the uses, one of the purposes of green infrastructure is to um, decrease urban flood situation as the flood peak or the timing of the flood. I think how does green economy reinforce green infrastructure? That's an interesting question. Would you want to take that?
How does economy reinforce green infrastructure? Ideally, it's part of city design to take into account what infrastructure to at the Netherlands. There's a lot of experts specifically for this field who know how to implement green infrastructure, how much of an effect it can have. But the people who are actually planning the urban environment do not always have immediate access to that knowledge. So each city has to make plans, and then the richer cities have more access to this type of knowledge and to integrate structure within a wider green economy plan. But the not so the more rural this is also the case that they have less inhabitants, thereby taxes, less money available to them. Mm, what is coincidental there is that they also have less need because they have a less dense urban environment. They have more natural space, so they have less of a pressure to actually implement green infrastructure.
Uh, can I add a related discussion here? I have a question which I think would be pertinent. Just to clarify a bit more on the term green infrastructure, is it
Mhm.
one of the applications of nature-based solutions to help communities build
Yes.
resilience against extreme weather and climate change? So we have a lot of focus on nature-based solutions. So I just want to know if it becomes a part of that.
Yes, that's correct. We can go back to that slide. So within natural capital, there are nature-based solutions for actions that protect, manage, and restore the natural capitals. And in that sense, green infrastructure can be one of those nature-based solutions.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. I missed that.
All right. Let's go on for the next part, which is the ecosystem services cascade. This is a theoretical part, but it helps you find out ways how you can measure if green infrastructure is actually doing what you want it to do. Here you see the ecosystem services cascade. It has 5 parts. And on the left-hand side, you see ecosystems and biodiversity. And on the right-hand side, you see the human well-being parts. And for the value part, this is not just financial values, but also can be the sustainable development goals and specifically their targets. So the physical components of an ecosystem. And then the processes describe the dynamic interactions between these components. And together, these represent the supply side or the capacity side of an ecosystem to provide ecosystem services, which are in the middle. Then on the right-hand side, you have benefits and values. These represent the social system or the demand side of this model. The benefits are the material and non-material contribution of the ecosystems to human well-being, and the values express how we value those benefits. So this is a bit theoretical, so I like to show this in a more concrete example. For instance, for number 1, these biophysical structures, ecosystem structures, we can look at the example of trees. Trees have many different possible functions, and one of these is providing shade. Of course, other structures can also provide shade, but we're looking just at one example here. Then for the third part, the service here is climate regulation. The benefit is protection from solar radiation and heat, and then how we value that. It can be, for instance, this SDG 11, the value can be the local climate regulation. And if we look at the SDGs in more detail, there are two parts that are specifically related to this, which is SDG 11.7, universal access to safe, inclusive, and accessible green and public spaces, and 11.b, mitigation and adaptation to climate change and resilience to disasters. So now I'd like to look in more detail at the different parts of this ecosystem services cascade. We already saw a lot of examples of ecosystem structures, and you can imagine many more, I'm sure, as well as for the processes. So I'd like to start at ecosystem services. What are ecosystem services? These are classically divided into four categories, and these are things that benefits people obtain from ecosystems. So it's really a human-centered approach. And here in the picture, you can see four categories: supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural services. And they're usually named the same, but here on the right-hand side, you see supporting services are now named habitat services. What's important for us here for climate change adaptation is mostly part of these regulating services. So you could think of the climate change mitigation, but also water management. These are the types of services that ecosystems can provide for us. And there's so many benefits. This is part 4 of the cascade. I'd like to show some examples. You can think of physical or mental well-being. You can think of environmental benefits, social benefits, and also economic benefits. And they're usually classified in these four categories. But as you can also see, if you look in more detail at these benefits, there's also some overlap. If we have climate mediation, which is an environmental benefit, this also has effects on our health. Or if it's encouraging walking and cycling transportations, that also has economic and again, health effects. It's also said for economic effects, it impacts positively on the economic vitality of neighborhoods and centers, but that also can lead to gentrification. And again, here we see reduced energy uses that also has effects socially. So just to have a link to the SDGs, we see resilience can be improved through multiple types of the urban ecosystem services, providing resilience to specific events. And they can also really provide resilience for long-term events. It's also very much a planning mechanism that allows discussing sustainability agenda for different stakeholders. And finally, it concretely contributes to the urban resilience goals of growth, health, climate change, biodiversity loss, water, energy, and food security. Just to show one study that did a very great job in linking these specific ecosystem structures to then the ecosystem services and then the effects, which are in fact the benefits. And then, as it says, benefits to people, those are the things that we are actually valuing. You can make it extremely complex, but you don't really have to. You can make it easier to study if your intended benefits are actually being made. But first, I'd like to draw your attention, not just to benefits, but to ecosystem disservices, because a lot of nature is not always good for everyone. You can think of allergic reactions. You can think of routes that break up the pavement. You can think of people who don't like animals or insects, which are attracted by the green infrastructure. And we also have some concrete results that if you have green infrastructure, you have to add fertilization, but this then would reduce the quality of the stormwater runoff. Also, tree shade can be nice, but especially in colder climates, this would increase the winter heating demand and reduce the thermal comfort. Specifically for large street trees, there's a combination. If you plant them in a certain way, it actually captures the air pollution level at the street level. And if you have a large park, then it takes a longer time for people who are traveling around this, which would actually increase mobility and fuel consumption. And finally, these animals and insects can also lead to spreading of diseases, or it could lead to increased use of pesticides. So these are things to keep in mind if you want to implement green infrastructure. For policy trade-offs, there's a lot of obvious benefits, but there's also some trade-offs with securing energy supply, promoting biomass and biofuels, as we saw, minimizing congestion, and also certain agricultural and transportation and economic growth goals. So this depends on what are the goals in your local area. So about these benefits, where and when do they take place? You also have to think about this. You will see different geographical scales. And then if we look at this study, we see that these different geographical scales can have different effects on the benefits you want to have. So for improved water quality, flooding, and health, all of the scales are found to be effective. If we look at CO2 reduction and you only look at one building or one block, then you won't reach your intended benefit. You have to scale up your project. And we also see that for thermal comfort and improved air quality, we still have some research to be done. We don't know yet if that can be proven. For the temporal scale, here you can see an example of green infrastructure for stormwater and flood management. So the initial outcomes on the short term, you can see there will be less flooded properties, there will be more education, there will be more access to recreation. But only on the longer term, as you are preventing floods or they're reduced, then you can see less accidents, less illnesses, less stress, increased property values, and increased knowledge of the functions and benefits of green infrastructure. And ultimately, the long-term outcomes would be improved physical health, mental health, economic well-being, and flood resilience. But it's good to keep in mind, these are, of course, also affected by many other factors. So you have to figure out how to determine what's the influence of green infrastructure on these long-term outcomes. And keep in mind, what is valued changes over time. But most importantly, the benefits and services take place over different timeframes. That was the end of this part. And again, I'd like to ask you, do you have any questions about this
We are
section?
lucky because by now we have a bunch of really good questions.
Great.
I'll start off by a really interesting question by Mutahir Awan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning. He's asking, do the climate credits can they be applied? Can they be adopted as one of the criteria for giving approvals to development by the authorities? I'm assuming this relates to. He's talking about GI and climate credits related to that.
I'm not sure what climate credits are.
I think climate credits would be in the sense that if you have an offset activity, if let's say an organization is doing an activity which has some carbon footprint, so they can have that, okay, we have these activities instead which sequester carbon dioxide, and you would be eligible for some carbon credits because of that.
Yes, so if you fly by airplane, you pay extra so that somewhere a tree is planted. At the moment, really the state of the world is that we need to reduce our consumption of energy, of everything really, because consuming everything costs energy. So I don't recommend the mindset of this planting or implementing green infrastructure to compensate for something. You need to implement green infrastructure anyway, and you need to reduce the thing that you're trying to compensate.
Okay, we have another interesting question, which is you mentioned gentrification in the context of green infrastructure. Could you please revisit that?
Yes, what I briefly touched upon is that for benefits, economic benefits, it's often said the areas improve, the housing prices, the properties become more valuable because there is green infrastructure. And for the Netherlands, there have been studies that show the proximity of trees and the amount of trees directly affects how much a house can be worth. But that means if you apply green infrastructure to a location where there is none, that means the properties become worth more, which is nice if you're a property owner. But if you're renting, it means gentrification. So that's not always straightforward good effect for the people who are living in the area. You need to make sure they have the economic capacity to stay living in that area and then enjoy those health benefits as well.
Thank you so much. So we have another question by Ziaul Islam. He's one of the students in the MS Public Policy program. He is asking, what if green infrastructure uh, is believed to be disturbing water levels in Pakistan? A type of a tree largely planted by the government is considered to be dangerous for the water table. So I think his question is, if we are planting trees which are uh, not which may be of an invasive species. In this case, it was a foreign species which is planted by the government of Pakistan, and it is known to be affecting the water table. So I think, uh, do we need to be selective in what sort of uh, green infrastructure is being selected or planted, and how do we sort of determine uh, what is good or bad green infrastructure, maybe?
Yes, that's a good question, and very much so. You have to take into account the local circumstances. There is no one clear, one size fits all green infrastructure solution for everywhere. Having invasive species can be very dangerous. We've also seen this in Japan, where there was a lot of erosion, and Japan is 70% mountainous area. So this led to landslides. And what the government initiated last century was to plant the sugi tree everywhere everywhere, and that went fine for a long time. But after 20 years, these trees were full grown and started blooming, and then it turned out that at least 25% of the Japanese population is heavily allergic to these trees. So there's literally a time of year when most Japanese cannot work efficiently because of their heavy allergies to this tree.
It's very relatable. We have the same problem in Islamabad, where we have mulberry trees, and they cause a proper allergy season, and a lot of people are affected by it, and it's considered now an invasive species.
Yes, please take the local circumstances into account. Find native species where possible.
Okay, we have another question by another student from the graduate program. His name is Samiullah. He asks, the ecosystem services associated with such projects are inherently unquantifiable, thus making it difficult to conduct a reliable cost-benefit analysis from a policy point of view. How do we
Uh,
move forward with such projects in absence of concrete numbers and context-specific data
mhm.
about the ability or consistency with which such projects can deliver the level of benefits expected in comparison to traditional solutions? It's a
That's
bit of a loaded question, but
yes,
I
a
hope
really
that
good
it,
question. This is the reality we have to deal with, and that's actually also what the next section is about. So I hope maybe if I first show the next section, then it might become more clear.
okay, that's great. I think we can move forward, and then we can take the rest of the questions at the end. Is that okay?
All right. So measuring green infrastructure performance, how do you know it's doing what you want, but also how do you know that it's worth it? First of all, if we look at what is the monetary value, say you want to build a green wall or a retention area or some green parking spaces, how do you even calculate the monetary value? There's a lot of questions you have to take into account. Are you looking at implementing and maintaining these measures? Are you also looking at the avoided costs that you save, like you have less water treatment, you have increased health? Are you also including the potential co-benefits, like improved aesthetic quality, improved social cohesion? That wasn't the target of your project, but you're getting those benefits anyway. And are you also looking at the services like the displacement of prior residents or increased risk of allergies? These are questions you have to think about when you're considering how do you calculate just the monetary value. But I also have some possible solutions. So don't be too disheartened by this fact. There is no consensus on a model that is comprehensive and integrative across all types and aspects of green infrastructure and ecosystem services. It doesn't mean we are fully lost. We do have some ways to calculate what are the potential benefits. How much does this really give us? So one way is the driving force pressure state impact response model. This is a very long model, but we're going to look at the impact side. You can see there already ecosystem services and functions. And an indicator, that's what we'll be looking at. An indicator is a thing that indicates the state or level of something else. So like car ownership is used as an indicator of how much wealth people have. So then we can look at key performance indicators. So we don't actually measure the individual ecosystem services, we measure indicators. And here you see again these four categories: economic, social, cultural, human health, and ecological. So you could measure these benefits through an indicator individually. You can get things such as this Green View Index made by the MIT, and this measures how many trees are in a town. So you could use that as an indicator for saying how many people have access to green infrastructure. A lot of indicators have been developed and measured. And I'd like to point you to the most relevant ones related to climate change adaptation. For ecological and health indicators, you can see these here. And for social, cultural indicators and economic indicators, you can see these here. So maybe for most projects, you want to measure more than one thing. So then you have different indicators. I like to point out the message here is that you will have a lot of different indicators. You cannot compare these. You have to look at these individually. If you look at these table and then at the unit of measurements, we're looking at tons of carbon per hectare per year, cost of sewage treatment, square kilometers, a count or magnitude, tons of pollutants, a probability, a perceived level of trust, and a percentage of people. These aren't comparable numbers, so you have to really look at them individually. And also, we can have these benefits that lead to double counting. If we look at thermal comfort and improved air quality, these contribute to human health and the quality of life, but these also depend on other issues. So you can't say it's a direct relationship. And also one more point, for instance, if we look at an aesthetically pleasant floodplain, you have flood protection. You can also have recreation, and this can also have practical knowledge. So you can count for many of these different benefits through one and the same project. You have to keep in mind you can't compare these measurements. There's some other methods such as environmental impact assessment and cost benefit assessment. And what's important to keep in mind there is that the ecosystem services, especially for culture or spiritual experience or sense of place, these are less represented in these methods. It's more difficult to account for them properly. And there's also multi-criteria decision analysis. There you really talk to all the stakeholders and ask them what they think is most important. But that's exactly the problematic part of this method, because then people will focus more on what problems they have rather than what green infrastructure might do to solve this. Just to show one example of how you can value green infrastructure, we have a tree monitor. And I'm sorry, but this website is in Dutch. But what it does is it really it uses the satellite images and AI to determine the height, the species, the wood volume, and the carbon sequestration of every tree. It's still working on the below ground, the subsurface roots, and the protective zones around the trees. But based on this information, it then calculates how much money is saved. And just looking at the city of Enschede, where our university is in the top left of this image, near the most of the green part, it's saving the city almost 14 million euros a year. So that's it for this part. And the next part would be implementation and more information. But first, I'd like to know if you have questions on this part, especially if the previous question is answered.
Okay, I have some interesting questions so far. There is one question related to the indicators for the two targets that you mentioned related to the SDGs. I think that was from the second part. And are they those targets easily measurable? What are the question is what are the indicators for those targets? I think it was in the second part of your lecture where you were talking about SDG 11.
Yes.
So are those easily measurable, and are they also linked with um, GI? I mean, those indicators, are those also linked with GI?
Yes, so you and I recently shared some information on how the SDGs are monitored and measured, and we saw that for some main goals, there are measurement ways in existence, and there also is data from different countries. But especially 11B is one of these targets. I believe there is no information just yet. So while I can show you this is how green infrastructure can help reach this goal, it doesn't mean it's measured yet on a global basis. But I think that's a good website to share with your students afterwards, if that's possible.
We have another question, which is many ecosystem benefits are not fully recognized. That's what you mentioned in your slides. Uh, we see that some of these indicators are quite hard to measure. And also, one of the significant benefits of GI may be improved groundwater recharge, which is quite relevant for sustainability of groundwater in countries like Pakistan. So, is that accounted for in the benefits somewhere? Groundwater recharge,
Let
because
me check. Yes.
for us right now, in for example in Lahore, I think it's quite a relevant issue as there's over extraction of the groundwater and the water table appears to be going down. There's a downwards trend over the years. So that seems like a very interesting benefit of that GI could offer for places like Pakistan.
Especially hydrology is one of the main benefits if we look at retention areas or also green roofs and walls, um, uh, because it can capture the water but also delays the main flood peak. So that means the water is captured for a longer time and helps replenish the groundwater table. So you can see here for hydrological regulation, flow control, and flood reduction, this is one of the already existing indicators being applied in many research. And you can search for the more specific green infrastructure types to see which has the most effect. So yes, there's a lot of available information on this.
I think this successfully answers a few other questions as well. For example, one was Rahil Abbas asking how important is green infrastructure solving urban flooding and improving aesthetics. I think you all already just mentioned the solving urban flooding part, where it slows down the flood peak and improves groundwater recharge. It also helps with flood attenuation. So that's one of the benefits. How about improving aesthetics? I think we also covered that earlier, or would you like to take it up?
Yes, it is, of course, subjective, but what is already found from hospital studies is that people who see greenery, even if it's a painting of a flower, they already recover faster from their illnesses on average. So we know there's a lot of value, not just aesthetically enjoying it, but also your mental and physical well-being. So there's a lot of reason why you would want to implement green infrastructure, and there are studies available for this where the effect is measured.
Okay. Um, okay. Another question, if you have time, is our whole discussion is about environmental issues, but I need only answer what is the opportunity cost to save our environment? That's from Talha. He's again a student from the MS Public Policy program.
I think when people do cost benefit studies, what they're often forgetting is to incorporate the cost of doing nothing. What happens if you don't solve this problem? And whether that's by green infrastructure or other measures, that can be fine. But people don't include the cost of doing nothing. And we see continuously, this is horrendous. This is more costing us more in terms of mental health, physical health, environmental degradation. Yeah. I'd like to see a true cost benefit study including that.
Okay. There is another question by Professor Mutahir Awan. How climate regulations can be devised at neighborhood level in line with SDG 11? Is there any example?
If I look again at the Netherlands, what we're doing now is we have a Climate Act because we have a climate organization who sued our government and won because the government wasn't doing enough to bring the Paris Accord into effect. They said, yeah, we signed this agreement, but then we're not actually making any policies. So now they made policies since 2019. There's a climate act and we have to do stuff. So every municipality now has to make a plan how they're going to be completely energy neutral by 2050 and also have a significant percentage of renewable energy by 2030. It's a huge change to implement. I'm very excited to help really bring it about. I don't know if it's going to be successful to what degree, but we're really trying to implement it on a national scale. I'm sorry, I lost the question.
No, that's quite relevant. That makes sense, and I think that's the right direction. At least I see Netherlands moving ahead with uh, uh, the policies and legislation related to climate change, because of course it's one of those countries which is most affected by its consequences. So it appears to be leading the way and sets an example not just for the developing countries but also for the developed countries.
We have the neighborhood implementation plans, so that's on a suburban level. I'm really just waiting to see if we can make it work.
Another question from Mohammed Ehsan is, what would be the policy and regulative capacities to preserve green spaces in peri-urban areas?
In what kind of urban
In
areas?
peri-urban areas, I mean,
Uh,
the areas at the fringe. Yeah.
well, there is more space available to do things on average. So what we have seen for many green infrastructure studies, if we look, for instance, at the type of green infrastructure like green roofs and green walls, these are more acceptable in the dense urban city centers where there's no space, but also they have the least effect. Any effect you can think of that a green roof or a green wall can do, it is amplified by at least 100 degrees if you can actually make surface level parks, forests, grass, anything. So you have much more space to have more effect there. Does that answer the question? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think the example is from areas maybe similar to Tsukuba, where we have
Mm.
some agriculture areas and sort of an urban uh, or grey infrastructure encroachment over those areas and expansion happening. And how do we sort of regulate the green spaces, and how do we sort of stop them from completely shrinking?
Mm.
So
It's
I think,
interesting you mentioned Tsukuba because there the regulations were that if you build a large apartment building, you have to have an equally sized space available for water retention. So that had implementation effects that every nice apartment building had some park nearby. So that helps for at least
yeah,
the flood management.
absolutely,
I see we're actually out of time, but maybe we would like to look at the last part. What do you think?
absolutely. Let's move on to that.
I'll go through it quickly. You can look in more detail if you want more information about these parts. For practical approach, the World Bank is recommending you look at 5 different dimensions, which is technical. Does it actually lower the cost and increase the quality and improve the resilience of the services that you're looking at? The social dimension. Are the stakeholders actually supporting this design? The economic dimension, can you justify it in terms of the cost? And then please also look at the cost of doing nothing. The financial dimensions, this is different because this is about, can you actually find the finances to implement it? And then the enabling policies. So there's a lot of related spatial policies involved usually, and what can be done to help enable green infrastructure. You don't have to do everything at once, even though green infrastructure can have so many benefits. You could focus, for instance, on light change and look only at connectivity. So then you're connecting green structures that enhance natural ventilation and cooling. Or you could look at climate change and social inclusion, and then include the groups of vulnerable people that are vulnerable specifically to climate change and involve them in the planning of your urban green infrastructure. Some guidelines for distance to coolness for the Netherlands, given our climate, we set this to 300 meter for people with less mobility and 500 people for more average people mobility. And then coolness is a location where the apparent temperature is on average 14 degrees Celsius lower. So then we get these type of maps of our cities. And this really shows that if you were to implement green infrastructure to help solve heat stress, you should do it in these red areas first, because there you have the most pressure. Of course, you could also do other solutions. This is a gray infrastructure measure to provide more shade. If you really can't do green infrastructure, you can always do something else. Here I have several slides on examples of implementation. Please excuse this Dutch side, but you can see from the icons, there are different goals, and some of these solutions are more efficient in reaching multiple goals than others. So you can choose what you do in your garden. There's also some European projects, some projects around the world, some instances where the World Bank has financed green infrastructure. And also, if you want to learn more specifically on heat and health or on urban nature, and also on existing projects in the EU. So that's it for this part. Usually I end with a part of reflection where you think about what's the three most important things you learned, what kind of links do you see between this topic and your work field and society at large, and if there's one thing you would like to learn about more, what would that be? My final slide is, if you want to know about any possible research topics, do let me know. If you want to do a master's thesis, I would be happy to supervise this or comparable topics. So that's it for me. I like to know any final questions.
Do we still have, can I borrow you for a few minutes and we can answer a couple questions? Is that okay?
Yes.
So we have a question from Anna. She's a student from the MS Public Policy program. She is asking, do you think protection of environment and biodiversity is one of the greatest civilization challenges of the 21st century, and educational institutions also need to highlight such issues further?
Yes, I agree. I mean, how can we not agree? I think it's more a matter of thinking about how we can highlight this importance in education, but also for policymakers.
Okay, we have another question, which is, please elaborate more on the financing and long-term maintenance aspect from the perspective of developing countries. In countries like Pakistan, the state usually lacks the resources and willingness to fund such projects, especially when the data around the costs and effectiveness is still relatively unreliable. The solution can be private investment or transferring the burden to individual property owners. How do we make such projects profitable and create other incentives which are attractive for private investment?
There are many such examples available. One that comes to mind is from a street where the people could select if they wanted to have a tree in front of their house, but then they were also made to be responsible for the maintenance of this tree. So it wasn't just a small tree that would be mature over 20 years. It was already quite mature and then requires regular maintenance. So the people then were taught how to perform the maintenance. They had access to specific tools they could share to perform this maintenance. So there was some governmental investments required upfront for tools, but also for education. And then, of course, not everybody wants to join the project, but most people did. And then this it helps convince other people if there's already an example that they can see. So it is possible to involve people in different ways and not have costs just for the government.
So yeah, the last small part of the same question was, how do we incentivize a person to invest in green wall or a green roof? It's related to what you just said.
Yeah, it really depends on their own situation. If you're a homeowner, you're much more easily convinced by the benefits, such as you will have a lower energy consumption due to the increased isolation. You will have less likelihood of very localized flooding from groundwater or from precipitation. And you will have a very nice, attractive green roof that usually you can look at it, even if you're outside or inside your house. But for people who are renting, this is a much more difficult option, and you really have to look at what are people's financial situation. That's the same kind of question we're facing now with our energy transition for this climate law, because we're asking people to really like put solar panels on their roofs or install a heat pump. And for homeowners who think, okay, I'm going to live in this house for the coming 30 years, it makes sense because they earn their money back. But if you're renting, or if you already lived in your house for 40 years, you're not going to make this investment. And there's many other reasons where if you're just, you're living in poverty, you have other issues, you're not going to be doing this by yourself. You need extra financial help to make this type of investment.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think we have taken a lot of your time, even more than what we expected earlier. So and I think there's a lot of things that gives the participants things to think about. For example, there's a lot of potential opportunities in which they can follow up with you for research if they are inclined so. And I think they will have some things to think about. I'm still waiting for some more questions to come in from all of them so I can make that a part of their examination. So that is a very creative homework that we have set for the participants. So uh, on that note, thanking you again from the Center for Disaster Management and from the School for Governance and Society in UMT. I thank you again for your time. I also want to thank everyone of the students and other participants. Some faculty members also made it to this lecture. Really appreciate their time and for listening in. And for those who couldn't join us, I'll just like to mention again that we'll be putting up the recording of this lecture for everybody's benefit on social media. And over there you can access it. It will be on our LinkedIn page, on our Facebook page, and also on YouTube. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me today. Thank you for your active questions, and also good luck with your exam.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karina.
Bye-bye.